Okay, good evening, everyone. Good evening. My name is Sophia Williams, and I will be conducting the interview this evening with our three guests. Uh, Today, as folks know, is September 11th, 2025, and we have three very special guests on the show today. And the first guest we have here is David Abdulah. Then we have Gerald Perreira and Ricardo Vaz. So, a bit of the bio on each of our guests, and then we get started into the questions. Gentlemen, welcome and thank you for being on with us this evening. Okay, so
Thank you.
give me 1 second. Okay, so David Abdullah, who joins us from Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago, is a retired trade unionist, an economist, and politician. He served as the General Secretary of the Oilfields Workers Trade Union and is the current leader of the movement for social justice. And David is a member of the Regional Executive Committee of the Assembly of Caribbean People. Gerald Perreira, who is joining us from Georgetown, Guyana, is a writer, an educator, theologian, and political activist. Mr. Pereira is also the chairperson of Organization for the Victory of the People based in Guyana, as well as an executive member of the Caribbean chapter of the Network for the Defense of Humanity and the Caribbean Pan African Network. And lastly, we have Ricardo Vaz, who is based in Caracas, Venezuela, and who is a journalist, political analyst, and editor at Venezuela Analysis. So again, David, Gerald, and Ricardo, thank you so much for coming on the show, and welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you.
So
Thank you.
Thank you so
yes,
much for having us.
yes, definitely. So let's get to our first question here. Let me just pull this up. Okay, so today we wanted to talk to you about the latest escalation in the tactics that's been employed by the U.S. in its war against Venezuela. So on August 18th, the U.S. military deployed more than 4,000 Marines and sailors to the Southern Caribbean and Latin America, and no fewer than three naval destroyers, along with a nuclear-powered fast attack submarine, a spy aircraft, and a guided missile cruiser to the waters of Venezuela. So this move comes after President Trump signed a secret directive authorizing the military force to carry out a regime change operation under the counter narcotics guise. And that's directed at Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, while at the same time, Trump has put a $50 million bounty on President Maduro's head. So, in response to all of this, the Venezuelan Defense Minister Vladimir Pedrino Lopez warned the U.S. not to, and I quote here, dare set foot on Venezuelan territory, stressing that any action that violates Venezuela's sovereignty would be considered, quote, an aggression against all of Latin America and the Caribbean. And President Maduro announced the integration of the Bolivarian National Militia, so that the militia is present in over the 5,000 communal circuits across the nation and can more effectively build a comprehensive defense of the nation. On September 2nd, the U.S. military killed 11 Venezuelans in strike on, on an alleged drug boat leaving Venezuela. Yet another reckless escalation and provocation against Venezuela. The Pentagon has also accused the Venezuelan Air Force of, I quote, highly provocative, alleging that the Venezuelan fighter jets flew near the U.S. Navy warships. So, in response, President Trump ordered an additional 10 stealth fighter jets to the military buildup in the Caribbean. So, Ricardo, we wanted to start off by posing this question to you as someone living and reporting in Caracas. What is your reaction, your analysis to this latest escalation against Venezuela and the Venezuelan people, and how are the people of Venezuela reacting to this particular aggression?
Hello again, and thanks again for the invitation. It's great to be here again. There's a lot to unpack, so I mean, you can circle back if there's something I drop off. Maybe I'll start with the more recent developments and walk back. Just today, the Venezuelan government and the armed forces announced large-scale military drills across the country involving artillery units, the Air Force, naval units. So there's like a state of constant readiness in the face of what you were describing, this very dangerous US military escalation on Venezuela's proverbial doorstep, which is actually on the Caribbean Sea. So I think by now there are 8 Navy warships deployed alongside this nuclear propelled submarine and stealth fighters and other kinds of reconnaissance aircraft. So it's really a full-fledged deployment that, I mean, it may call itself as anti-narcotics, but it's clear that this is a muscle-flexing operation against Venezuela. You were mentioning this secret directive. I don't think there's any need for authorization when it comes to regime change against Venezuela. I think that's something that's permanently authorized for the US. Whether they are capable of achieving it or not, of course, is a completely different question. But we have seen a gradual escalation. This incident that you mentioned, whereby it was said that drones struck the small boat that was reportedly moving from Venezuela and heading to Trinidad. The US said that it had 11 people and was carrying drugs. It provided no evidence that the cargo was drugs. It provided also no evidence that the people on board were part of the so-called Tren de Aragua, which is a very loose definition that the US is using. It used to be a criminal organization that operated from prisons inside Venezuela. Then it kind of got embedded in migration, but it's very far from being this organized crime and even less so foreign terrorist organization. So it's more of a political excuse for the US to do this kind of escalation in terms of its foreign policy. But after that, when people were kind of taken by surprise of this extrajudicial execution in international waters, the Trump administration went further and said that it wasn't out of the question to strike targets inside Venezuela itself. In the past few days, maybe tensions have calmed a little bit, but this deployment continues, and it's very dangerous because it reminds us of past wars, like the Iraq War that was built on this fake argument of the WMDs. Here, it's the fantasy that there is a large-scale drug operation being run directly by President Maduro and high-ranking Venezuelan officials. There's absolutely no evidence of that. This is a cartel. It's called the Cartel of the Suns, Cartel de los Soles, that the US brings up regularly whenever it needs some kind of political excuse to launch any kind of attack, whether that's direct military escalation or economic sanctions against Venezuela. But there's no evidence at all of any drug activity related to this Cartel of the Suns. There's even less evidence of any involvement of Venezuelan officials in that. But even on the bigger picture, all kinds of reports about drug trafficking in the region, whether that's from the United Nations Office on Drug and Crime, and even the DEA itself, they all recognize that Venezuela is a very marginal player when it comes to drug trafficking routes. So most of the cocaine is produced in Colombia, and maybe 90% of it flows through the Pacific and Central America. It's very little that comes through the Caribbean, and not all of that goes to the US. Some of it goes to Europe. So it's a very serious escalation, a real escalation that's built on a very flimsy, and that's putting it very mildly, a very flimsy argument of anti-narcotics, narco-terrorism operations. So now to the Venezuelan reaction. I was mentioning these military exercises. There's an absolute climate of defiance in face of these threats. The idea that neither the Venezuelan government, and especially not the Venezuelan people, are going to bow down to these threats. And you mentioned in the question the Bolivarian militia. The Bolivarian militia was created by Chavez, if I'm not mistaken, in 2006, as a kind of voluntary corps that would complement the traditional armed forces as more of a territorial-based unit. And there has been a drive of people signing up to join the militia. Of course, I mean, it's a much less organized body than the traditional armed forces units, but it goes to show that there's a wave of sentiment in terms of defending the homeland and rescuing the tradition of the independence heroes who fought against the Spanish Empire, as well as the recent anti-imperialist tradition in Venezuela. So the climate is of a lot of tension and a lot of concern, because the Trump administration has shown itself to be very reckless. And we have to keep in mind that it's always playing for a domestic audience. So it's doing things in these international theaters, but it's mostly towards a domestic audience. And there's also an issue of the failing US hegemony that I think we're going to get to later. But I mean, this is responding to the needs to create some kind of distraction. And with that in mind, it's not really following necessarily what's in its best interests or any kind of rational foreign policy. That's why this state of tension and constant alert is going to be necessary in Venezuela.
Thank you for your insights and for clearing up a lot of these things for us. So thank you again. So turning now to Gerald Perreira. So it seems that the U.S. has increasingly been trying to use Guyana, which is in the middle of the of an oil boom, to further the interests of the U.S. and Wall Street imperialism. So to this end, the U.S. has been using the oil and the resource-rich Essequibo region as one of the ways it is attempting to divide and conquer the people of Guyana and Venezuela against each other. So, Gerald, can you tell us, with Guyana's recent presidential election, which was held on the 1st of September, with the incumbent president, Irfan Ali, winning a second 5-year term in office, and building off of what Ricardo just outlined, what is your take, your analysis of what's going on in the region in terms of Guyana, Venezuela, and the role of the U.S. and the Wall Street imperialism? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Let me just draw your attention to this. The U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of War, it's no longer defense, it's war. So they're getting more aggressive, more hostile. Joseph Umre and a delegation came into Guyana a few days ago. This is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for War. But last year, April 2024, William Burns, the head of the CIA, was in Guyana. And before that, in February, that was April, the CIA head was in Guyana February last year. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Greenfield Thomas, she was in Guyana too. And they were all talking about their unwavering support for Guyana's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The United States regime, and we brought out a handbill some time ago, a couple of months ago. Our organization, the Organization for the Victory of the People, we're telling the Guyanese people that the United States intelligence services, the U.S. government, is feeding the government of Guyana a lot of lies, misinformation, and false propaganda. We're saying that they're setting Guyana up for war. So Guyana can be used as a launching pad, and by extension, now we're seeing Trinidad, as a launching pad for their acts of aggression against Venezuela. And we've been saying that for a long time, and now it is actually playing out. We said that Trinidad would get involved. And it's interesting that the three countries, the three giants of CARICOM, have come out openly in support of U.S. hostility, of U.S. imperialism. That's Jamaica, Guyana, and Trinidad and Tobago. All the other CARICOM countries have taken a position declaring the Caribbean region a zone of peace and condemning the buildup. The Ali government, in fact, I just want to make this clear. Ever since the death of President Forbes Burnham, the Guyana went full swing on a right-wing trajectory. We accepted neoliberal economics. We allowed the IMF and the World Bank to impose the structural adjustment program of us, that where we sold off state assets, we cut the military by 2 battalions and all of that. Guyana is a captured state. The recent elections that were held on September the 4th, all the political parties, all 6 of the political parties that contested elections are committed to neoliberal economics, and none of the parties have came out and said anything about the U.S. buildup in the region. They're all silent. They're all silent on the genocide in Gaza. These are 2 things that is crystal, it's clear. The only organization that has come out openly to condemn the U.S. aggression, what the U.S. is doing in the region, and condemn the genocide in Gaza is the Organization for the Victory of the People. In fact, all of these parties, and we say it to their face, we say that y'all are scared of the imperialists. And Marco Rubio was in Guyana not too long ago. And when you listen to the way the man spoke, he was talking as though Guyana was a state or a colony of the United States. President Ali is talking about protecting our territorial, defending our territorial integrity and all of that against Venezuelan aggression. But we made it clear, the threat to Guyana is not Venezuela. The threat to Guyana is United States imperialism. The U.S. intention is to put a military base, and I suspect they already have something somewhere located in the country, is to have a military presence in Guyana. And I believe that's what the CIA chief was here about. And that was during the Biden administration time. So you see this continuation from the friendly fascism to the naked fascism of Trump, because both regimes are hostile to the Bolivarian Revolution. So the idea is to put a military base here to provoke a confrontation with Venezuela, and then attack Venezuela, and you occupy Guyana in the meantime, and then you can occupy places in spaces in Venezuela. There's a pattern. This is what they did in Syria. They did it in Iraq. Up to today, U.S. troops have military presence in Iraq. Three times the Iraqi parliament voted unanimously for them to pull their troops out, and the U.S. refused. So you have the popular mobilization brigades that are shooting rockets. They, with the support of Iran, they're shooting rockets and missiles at the U.S. bases. So often they will have confrontation. So they did the same thing in Syria, where they occupied parts of Syria under the Assad regime and was looting the oil and gas from the area. This idea is, and this thing, our leaders are, and I'm going to be open, our leaders are political dunces. They do not understand what is happening here. This is not just about Guyana and Venezuela. This has serious implications for the region as well as global politics. And they believe that the United States is here to defend us against Venezuela. But these political dunces, if you look at our history, for years, the United States has always backed Venezuela on the territorial issue against Guyana. It's there. But now the US is supporting Guyana. They're friends of Guyana because there is a regime, a government, a revolutionary process in Venezuela that they're opposed to. So they're now friends of Guyana. If the dynamics, if it's changed tomorrow, and you have a right-wing government in Venezuela and a revolutionary government in Guyana, they will be opposing the revolutionary government in Guyana, supporting the right wing in Venezuela. It's back to Henry Kissinger. We keep saying this. No permanent friends, no permanent enemies, just permanent interests. And I listened to our foreign minister saying that Guyana will not be intimidated by Venezuela. Well, this man is such a complete, and I'm going to say it, he's a complete fool, because the threat to our sovereignty, our independence, and our territorial integrity is the United States. And they're actually trampling on our sovereignty. The Ali regime, the Ali administration, sovereignty and independence can be staring them in their face, and they don't know what it is about. Because for them, independence is what this false independence, this flag and anthem independence. We have our own head of state, our own anthem, our own parliament. But I know, I reside in Guyana, very strategic decisions about this country is made outside of Guyana and imposed on the various governments, whether it's the Ali administration or even the APNU administration. So what we have is a case of Guyana being your typical neo-colonial state, a captured state, being bullied by the US administration, and they're afraid of it. President Ali, on his inauguration Sunday last, while he was swearing in, 2 US fighter jets flew over the capital. That is an insult to our independence and to our sovereignty and territorial integrity. That is the threat. No plane from Caracas has flown over our territory. And this is what we're dealing with now. One person in some quarters, some people are deliberately peddling the fallacious, this lie that Perreira is defending Venezuela, saying that the Essequibo belonged to Venezuela. I never said that the Essequibo belonged to Venezuela. As an anti-colonialist and an anti-imperialist, I understand the history of West European invasion in this part of the world, in so-called discovery, colonial genocide against the indigenous peoples, the trade in captured Africans, and so on. I understand that. But as I pointed out, once the baby is out of the womb, you cannot stuff it back in. I believe that Venezuela and Guyana as neighbors have to sit down and talk. We cannot change that dynamic. Venezuela cannot be removed and Guyana cannot be removed from where it is. We are neighbors and nothing can change that. But hostile forces are pushing for a conflict. They do not want peace. They're misleading the government of Guyana, feeding them a lot of lies, and they're buying into it. And we are very concerned about this because as a Pan-Africanist, and if you look globally, all the Pan-African organizations all over the world, in the motherland of Africa and in the diaspora, are supporting the Bolivarian revolution. As an anti-imperialist, as a Pan-Africanist, I know that the Venezuelan revolution, the Bolivarian revolution, has moved indigenous peoples and Africans from the margin of the society to the center. And as a Pan-Africanist and an anti-imperialist, I have to support the Bolivarian revolution. My position on the territorial issue is something different. So I am not, as a Pan-Africanist, I will never take a position that dovetails with imperialism. And I have put the Guyana government on notice, and I'm putting them on notice that when the tables turn if they ever allow the US a presence in this country and the tables turn, we will put them on trial for treason. They will be put on trial for treason because this is meant to be a sovereign and a sovereign country, and the Caribbean is meant to be a zone of peace. The founding fathers of CARICOM fought for that, and we have an obligation to defend that. Our ancestors did not fight against slavery and colonialism for us to kick the enemy out of the front door, while these neo-colonial stooges who masquerade as presidents and prime ministers but are nothing but overseers of the new plantation are bringing the imperialists not even through the back door but openly through the front door.
Wow. Thank you so much, Gerald, for the insights, for the passion, and just the straight up truth. Thank you again. So turning now to David Abdulah, in addition to Guyana seemingly willing to play a sort of proxy role for the U.S. against Venezuela, disappointingly, the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Kamala Persad Besessar, stated, and I quote, "I want to make it very clear that if the Maduro regime launches any attack against the Guyanese people or invades Guyanese territory, and a request is made by the American government for access to Trinidadian territory to defend the people of Guyana, my government will unflinchingly provide them this access." End of quote. So, David, building off of what Ricardo and Gerald just wonderfully outlined, what is your analysis of what's going on in the region in terms of Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, Venezuela, and the role the U.S. and Wall Street imperialism is playing?
Thanks a lot, Sophia, and good evening to everyone. Thanks for having me on your program. Mrs. Persad Besessar has been drinking the Kool-Aid from the State Department for quite some time. And so even before this whole issue blew up, when she was leader of the opposition in the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago and leader of her party, she supported Juan Guaido as the president of Venezuela and supported the position of the Lima group of countries that were trying to use the OAS with Luis Almagro as the Secretary General of the OAS as a means to create a coup d'etat in Venezuela. She even at one time called on the United States, while she was leader of the opposition, to sanction Trinidad and Tobago following a visit to our country by the Vice President of Venezuela, Delcy Rodriguez, because she claimed that the plane on which the Venezuelan Vice President came into Trinidad and Tobago was a sanctioned plane, and therefore Trinidad and Tobago should be sanctioned by the US. And this was during the COVID period. So that is to tell you that her foreign policy position for quite some time has been that which aligns with the State Department. Now, therefore, when she became Prime Minister, April 28th this year, when it was the election, and she became Prime Minister, she was sworn in a couple of days afterwards. She made it very clear. In fact, even before that, when President Trump became president, when he was inaugurated in January, she issued a statement, congratulated him, and saying, well, which was okay, you normally congratulate an incoming head of government, head of state. That is a normal protocol. But she went beyond that and said that the Biden administration or the Democrats lost the election because they were too woke, too much diversity, equity, and inclusion, and so on. They had gone too far. And she thought that President Trump is what the United States needs at this point in time, which therefore was a clear political statement of support for the positions of the MAGA movement in the United States. So clearly she's been drinking that Kool-Aid for quite some time. And therefore, when this issue came about, that statement which you quoted from, she introduced the issue of Guyana when the United States itself had not, and up to now, has not introduced the issue of the Venezuela-Guyana border dispute. And I support the position of Gerald and so on. And my Venezuelan friends know that the borders cannot now be redrawn. Otherwise, you'd have to look at the whole of Africa after the partition of Africa in the Berlin Conference and redraw all of the borders. You'd have to go in the United States and redraw borders, and Texas and New Mexico and part of California and whatever will have to go back to Mexico. Those are the unfortunate facts of colonial and imperial history, but you can't now go and redo all of that damage. So, but the issue was never identified by the United States as the reason for its sending these huge military assets, and Ricardo described very well what they are, into the Southern Caribbean. It was always supposedly, according to the US narrative, about narco trafficking, and Ricardo clearly demonstrated that there's very little relative to the total quantity of drugs that come out of Latin America, South America. Relatively little goes through Venezuela. Some 5% perhaps of the cocaine transit through Venezuela, which half or more is captured by the Venezuelan authorities. So the real issue is about narco trafficking is really not about Venezuela at all. But the US has not identified the issue of Guyana and the border dispute with Venezuela as the reason for the placing of those military assets in the Southern Caribbean. So when Mrs. Prasad-Bissessar raised that issue, one wondered, well, there's several things about it. One wondered, why was she introducing that question into this conversation or narrative when it was not being a speaking point or a rationale by the US government itself? And therefore, was she therefore signaling something else by saying that Trinidad and Tobago could be used, even without being asked? Trinidad and Tobago could be used as a staging point to attack Venezuela, and so on, assuming that Venezuela would be attacking Guyana, which it is not going to do. So was that therefore laying the foundation for a possible red flag incident where there could be something that happens, and there was some report on election day of a boat carrying ballot boxes and officials of the Guyana Elections Commission on election day being supposedly attacked by people on the Venezuelan side or something to that effect, which could have been that false flag event, which could have then triggered her justification. So that is the first thing. The second very disturbing thing about her statement was that Trinidad and Tobago would then be clearly identified on the side of US imperialism. In the context where Trinidad and Tobago historically has been able to take positions on foreign policy together with Guyana over the years, and Jamaica and Barbados, and so on, recognizing Cuba in 1973, when no other country in this region except for Mexico recognized Cuba. 4 small, newly independent Caribbean countries did that. We supported the liberation struggles in Southern Africa, and which was contrary to US policy and the policy of Thatcher in the UK. We have recognized Palestine and so on, when that is contrary to US policy. So time and time again, our countries have historically stood up on the basis of principle in international relations, defending sovereignty, because as small states, we have to defend our sovereignty. If we don't, then we become subject to being walked over by colonial and imperial powers. And Mrs. Prasad-Bissessar threw that tradition and that history out the door, which was a very shameful and sad day for Trinidad and Tobago. But since then, she has doubled down, because when the boat was attacked by the US, she then said that they should kill all these traffickers violently. She used that word. They should be all killed violently, and therefore, any notion of a judicial process, due process under the law, because we are opposed to narco trafficking, we are opposed to drug trafficking, trafficking in arms, trafficking in people, and so on. We are opposed to all of that. Those are criminal enterprises, and we are opposed to all of that. They do huge damage to individuals, to societies and communities, and so on. But everyone involved in those things has to also be subject to the rule of law. Because if we throw out the rule of law and say you could then kill anybody arbitrarily without trial, then innocent people will also be killed, because there's no evidence. The Trump administration has provided no evidence that this boat was actually carrying drugs. It could have been trafficking in people, because for a boat that size to carry 11 people plus a whole set of drugs which would be heavily weighted doesn't make much sense. And it certainly probably was not in international waters, because if it came out of Sucre State and so on, it would be running along the north coast of Venezuela. And then, assuming it was going to Trinidad, to the north coast of Trinidad or into the Gulf of Paria, which separates Trinidad from Venezuela. And therefore, they're not going to waste a lot of fuel by going north into international waters and so on. So there's a lot that has not been completed in that story. Yet Mrs. Prasad Bissessa said, kill all of them violently, which is wrong in international law. It is wrong in domestic law, because drug interdiction takes place in the Caribbean all the time. In fact, just the other day, Trinidad and Tobago Customs Authority seized narcotics which had come out of Miami or out of the United States. Ganja that came out, marijuana that came out of the United States. So there's trafficking from the north to the south as well. So there is interdiction and there's cooperation by our law enforcement agencies in our various CARICOM countries and the United States. U.S. Coast Guard routinely stops boats, seizes drugs, takes the persons, arrest the persons and have them tried. And that is what has to happen. And not just blow up people, because of course you were saying dead men tell no tales. We really don't know what happened. And then recently, the president of Colombia said that this boat may have actually been attacked in Trinidad and Tobago waters. And would the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago assist with trying to locate the bodies? And Mrs. Prasad Bissessa then made another horrible statement when she said she's not using any of our Coast Guard assets to look for any narco trafficker. And moreover, if any carcasses, that's the word she used, if any carcasses wash up on the shores, because 2 bodies have already washed up on the shore of Trinidad, if any carcasses wash up, they will then deal with it. So these are people, bad or good, we don't know, but they're human beings, or were human beings, and therefore their bodies that washed up on the shore, not carcasses. So she's doubled and tripled down on her language, and therefore, this is a major, major concern for the sovereignty of Trinidad and Tobago, for our international standing, and of course we'll come to discuss perhaps the implications for CARICOM in a while, because this is very worrying, and a number of people in Trinidad and Tobago have spoken out about her language, including some academics and other commentators. And of course, my party, MSJ, we have made quite a few statements on this matter.
Thank you so much, David, for your clear insight. And so we have another question, and now this is for all of you, if you'd like to answer. So the next question says, what role do you think the turning of the global order, whereby U.S. hegemony is waning and China, BRICS and multipolar world are on the rise? What role do you think this is all playing in this latest aggression by the U.S. against Venezuela, Latin America, and the Caribbean? Anyone can answer, or all three.
Let me go first and also touch on a couple of things. Gerald was making some very good points about sovereignty, and sovereignty, as he was saying, is not just about having your own flag and having your own anthem and having your own figureheads. I mean, the way in which you deal with your own natural resources is also a matter of sovereignty. And we talk about Guyana, and there's this oil boom, but under which conditions is it taking place? When we talk about the U.S. influence, it's also driven by getting the best deal possible for ExxonMobil. So there's also a matter of sovereignty, and also sovereignty of determining your own foreign policy, where he was mentioning that no party dare say anything about Palestine, and that's one, maybe it's not the most important factor, but one of the things that surely annoys the United States about Venezuela is its firm and unwavering position in support of Palestine, in support of Palestine liberation, and denouncing the ongoing genocide. So if we talk about the ongoing rise of the multipolar order, it's very clear that US actions, I mean, all over the world, but I mean, particularly here in the Caribbean, which is what we're talking about, they are kind of a reaction to an imperialist power that is losing its hegemony, and it's trying to react somehow to reassert itself, and it's doing so in ever more violent ways because the other channels have not worked. And so that's what we're seeing here in the Caribbean. But on the other hand, when we talk about BRICS, I feel that sometimes there's kind of an excessive optimism or too accelerated optimism in terms of what BRICS can provide right now. I mean, of course, it's a much welcome counterweight to US hegemony all over the world, but it also has its limitations. I mean, for example, BRICS has not taken a particularly strong position when it comes to genocide in Palestine. Just a few months ago, there was this attacks on Iran, which is a member of BRICS, and BRICS did not have a unified position, nor even any action in response to that. So it's something that's still a work in progress that has a lot of potential, but also risks being diluted and not having such a clear effect in terms of altering global politics and reducing the destructive effects of US imperialism. Also, something that Gerald said about this idea, it would be interesting at some point, I mean, just as an aside, to do something about the Essequibo and the history of this entire territorial dispute, because, as he was saying, the roles were flipped a few decades ago. In fact, this issue was more or less dormant until the 1960s when Guyana was approaching independence, and it was seen as a threat by the US, and the US used its ally, its puppet in Venezuela, to bring up again the sovereignty issue of the Essequibo and reopen the case, so to say. So it just goes to show that, beware, or know your own history and know the history of the region when it comes to allowing these U.S. interests into your home. And in the case of Guyana, Venezuela has denounced for a long time, and of course it has to maintain this position that there are plans to set up a military base in Guyana and taking advantage of this territorial dispute, which has a lot to be said, and I don't mean in any way to endorse everything that the Venezuelan government has done in this regard in recent years, but it's pretty obvious that the US is trying to take advantage of this unsolved issue to stoke the regional tensions and, as David was saying, create the conditions where you have all these military assets, and it's much easier to create a kind of Gulf of Tonkin incident where suddenly the tensions become a full-fledged conflict, and that will be damaging for everyone involved except the US, which is the superpower that's going to advance its interests precisely by stoking these tensions, generating these false flags, and putting these Caribbean countries and Venezuela and all the others in the region against each other, when in fact they should have, and they should identify very clear common interests against the US.
Anyone? Oh, David, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry. I was just going to say that we also have to understand U.S. Policy in the context of the 200-year-old Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt corollary. So the U.S. always sees this region as its sphere of influence, and quite clearly, apart from BRICS, the rise of China and the role of China in terms of the investments that China is making in the region, and so on, clearly is of concern to the United States, because it sees China as a principal enemy, and therefore wherever it could confront China, it will do so, or try to prevent China from becoming more influential diplomatically or economically. China is not involved in any colonial enterprise in the Caribbean, but through its economic investments and so on, more and more China has influence in the region. So I think that is clearly something that has to be identified, and the U.S. seeing the need to reassert its hegemony in this region at this time.
I'd just like to take up on a point that Ricardo touched on, and then get to David. When President Burnham was in office, of course, he allowed their Cuban troops, the Cuban planes, to refuel in Guyana. The planes would stop in Barbados and refuel, and pressure was put on Barbados. And Barbados gave in. And Burnham said the planes could refuel in Guyana, and the U.S. threatened to bomb the airport here. And at that time, when Burnham was taking such solid anti-imperialist positions and was a champion of the non-aligned movement and so on, supporting the Palestinian struggle, we had a Palestinian office in Guyana. The U.S. sold F-16 fighters to Venezuela, and they were edging Venezuela on to invade us. That was when you had the pro-imperialist regimes in power. And President Burnham launched the People's Militia. We created the People's Militia to defend the country. And today we've seen things have changed. We've all gone in a different direction. So you see the US now is saying that they're standing with Guyana. What is coming up next month on the 6th of October is the bombing of the Air Cubana plane in 1976, October the 6th. And the memorial, the commemoration is always low key. You don't hear much about it. It passes unnoticed, because if you're going to address that, you will have to talk about the culprits, who had full knowledge of it, and who facilitated the terrorists in executing that dastardly act of terrorism. And it's clear that the United States knew about it and encouraged it. But you will never get any one of the politicians, whether they're in the government side or in the opposition, nobody will point to U.S. imperialism as a culprit. You'll just hear it was an act of terrorism. But if you say identify the facilitators and enablers of the terrorists, you'll get silence. So that is where we are. The other thing is progressive forces in Guyana. If you take a certain position, you're being, it's like putting yourself out openly to be executed. I don't mean literally executed, but you can be executed in different ways. For example, I spoke at a Palestinian rally, and I was traveling out 1 month after when I got to the airport. I was traveling. I mentioned this to David, and I was prevented from leaving. I couldn't get on the flight, the British Airways flight to London, because the U.S. border security said that the plane that was taking me was traveling over U.S. territory, which is the Virgin Islands. So I was not able to go, and they told the British Airways if they put me on the flight, they'll stop the plane from taking off. So this is what we're faced with. There's a lot of bullyism. It's coming. The U.S. embassy operates like, when you listen to the U.S. ambassador, when you hear the U.S. ambassador talk or the EU ambassador, these people sound like colonial governors. They sound actually like colonial governors. And they're peddling this false narrative about Venezuela and Venezuelan Maduro and Maduro's. Look, most of the drugs that are entering the United States, the drugs are not coming from Venezuela. The drugs are coming from Mexico, from the Pacific side, and Ecuador. And so that is crystal clear. Many moons ago, I met a representative of the FARC in Libya. And he told me, when they were accusing FARC of drugs, that FARC had nothing to do with drugs. The drugs were being moved by the paramilitary, the right-wing paramilitary groups in Colombia were moving these drugs. And the American intelligence services had full knowledge of this. But they were supporting the paramilitaries in the fight against the National Liberation Army which is, I think, the second largest group that is still, I'm not sure what's their status now, if they enter into any sort of mediation with the new government, but they're still armed. And the FARC that had weapons at the time, that laid down the weapons and entered into the electoral process. But the US have knowledge of this. So to say that President Maduro is involved in drug running and all of that, it's outrageous. And they're talking about this cartel of sons or whatever they call it. They've been talking about that years ago, long before even President Hugo Chavez came into office. So they just resurrected this thing again. And it's all lies. So you want to go in and you talk about the war against drugs with submarines and 4,000 troops. It's the same way as David pointed out, or as Ricardo, I think, about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which was all a lie. And you took Britain and the US went into a war against Iraq. And then we added another outrageous lie that Gaddafi was killing his own people. And then you destroy Libya. And this is what they keep doing and doing. And our politicians these people don't seem to be able to learn. And even we have what you would consider very moderate, if you want to use that term, political activists who saying that the government is making a big mistake, that we are cozying up too much to the Americans and they are playing us in the wrong direction. And I'm worried for my country, because I know that once the US have a military presence in this country, they're not going to leave. They're not going to leave. In the same way they don't want to leave Iraq, and the same way they're still in Syria.
Thank you. All great comments and just as insightful. So another question for all three, if you'd like to answer. What are the broader regional and global implications of this escalating conflict? If the conflict turns into a hot war, or an even hotter war, who do you think will come to the support, if anyone, of Venezuela and the Venezuelan people?
Well, let me begin by saying that there are implications even if there's no further military escalation or there's no further military action, and that is that CARICOM is now very deeply divided. So one of the legacies of Trump 1.0 was the meeting that he had at Mar-a-Lago with selected heads of government of CARICOM. At that time, the then Prime Minister of St. Lucia, Prime Minister of Jamaica, I think Bahamas, and the President of Haiti, perhaps. And as a result of that, you found that those countries then became part of the Lima group, which I mentioned earlier, which supported this US attempt to create a coup d'etat in Venezuela. Other CARICOM countries were totally opposed to that. Now, with Trump 2.0, the actions that he has taken clearly has once again divided CARICOM, which is significant because CARICOM does have a position built into the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, which is the legal instrument that establishes CARICOM and which all CARICOM countries have ratified. It establishes the need for CARICOM countries to collaborate on foreign policy, and it has established the mechanism for that being the Council on Foreign and Community Relations. And that council, together with the heads of government, are supposed to coordinate on major matters of regional and international and global importance. And so you now have a situation where, since this military deployment, CARICOM has not met. Now, part of the excuse was that the chair of CARICOM currently, Prime Minister Holness of Jamaica, was in an election campaign because elections was last week, Wednesday, in Jamaica. But that couldn't have been the only reason. Clearly, they could not get a meeting because there would be no consensus among CARICOM countries, given the position, particularly of Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana, and most likely of Jamaica. And so you have this situation now where at the United Nations General Assembly coming up, likely that you will have CARICOM prime ministers speaking in support of this US so-called war on drugs and supporting military intervention and so on. You have a situation where CARICOM countries, all of which belong to CELAC, the Community of Latin American Caribbean States, majority of CARICOM countries supported the CELAC declaration the other day, or resolution. Trinidad and Tobago voted against it. I'm not sure if Guyana was part of that meeting, or Jamaica, because they had elections going on at that time. So you have this deep division, and in the OAS, that's going to play out again, because CARICOM as a block of 14 countries in the OAS was a buffer against US interventions. And what Rubio announced about a week and a half ago was there's this new so-called international coalition against drug trafficking, narco trafficking, which was not international at all, but is Peru, Ecuador, Argentina, Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago. Now, Argentina is not a country you want to be company with, not with right-wing Milei. Ecuador is the most violent country in this part of the world, in this hemisphere. And all the time there are major crises and riots in the prison and violence and so on. And Ecuador is one of the major transshipment countries for cocaine going to the United States. So Ecuador is certainly not a country you want to be engaged with. So in this situation, there is an attempt, well, CARICOM is deeply divided, and that is not good for the region in terms of our regional integration process. And then with these statements by the Trinidad and Tobago Prime Minister, in a sense, dismissing the president of Colombia, what Trinidad and Tobago is doing is isolating itself from Latin America, many Latin American countries, and from most of the rest of CARICOM, which is not healthy at all. And it will have implications for any attempt to engage with Africa. There was recently a African Union CARICOM summit over the last weekend. Trinidad and Tobago was represented at a very low level there, and so on. So our relationship South-South, which is crucial for trade, particularly and other economic relations, given what Trump is doing with tariffs and so on, all of that can be damaged by trying to cling on to Washington's coattails and drinking the Kool-Aid coming out of the State Department.
Yeah, the other thing is there's this anti-Chinese agenda. Rubio, when he came to Guyana, you could tell that the pressure is being exerted on the government of Guyana to minimize trade and economic relations with China. They're also they're applying pressure on Guyana to break with their Cuban medical mission in Guyana. And I am also worried that this is not just about Venezuela. After Venezuela, what next? I see this as a threat not just to Venezuela, but to Cuba, and by extension and going further to Nicaragua. This we can see this. This is clear. But a senior diplomat in the Chinese, in the People's Republic of China embassy in Guyana, he made a comment. He said that Guyana and Venezuela's neighbors need to talk. And spokesmen from the government went after him. They took a very hostile line, And we can see that the Trump administration, you've seen it even outside of the region. Trump is the reason Trump is talking to Russia is he wants peace with Ukraine and Russia so that he can focus his military attention on the Chinese, right? On Taiwan. That is because Trump cannot engage at the same time to confront China while there's a war going on with Russia and the Ukraine. So that is why he was pushing to end that war, the war in the area, but so that he can concentrate, because Trump is more hostile to the Chinese, because China is a rising power. And as Brother David pointed out, China was never part. Ships never left China and went to Africa and captured Africans. And China was not built on colonial genocide and the trade in captured Africans. In fact, China was colonized by imperial powers. And China is a power, but China is non-hegemonic, is not a imperial power. China has made it clear that irrespective of your size of a country and your economic position, you're treated with mutual respect and your sovereignty is respected. This is how the Chinese deal. This is a position. So when people say that China is an imperial power, I don't think they understand what imperialism is about. You know, we keep talking about this, and I pointed it out in a program that our brother David, as a political economist, will understand what imperialism is all about and so on. But people just bandy around these terms and talk nonsense. Had it not been for China, I can tell you some of the deals that we've obtained with the Chinese. No way we could have been able to get them with the IMF, the World Bank, or any Western country. And China has been doing a lot for Guyana since the 70s when we established diplomatic relations with the Chinese. Scholarships, the Chinese medical mission is here. They built the textile factories and many roads. So this went back to the 70s. So the Chinese presence in Guyana goes way back, way back. But as you said, this, I can't see, I think that an attack on Venezuela, I think Venezuela has friends, and I think that they're those, I suspect, that will come to the assistance of Venezuela in one way or one form or the other.
Yeah, let me just pick up on that and maybe answer a bit more concretely to what you were asking, Sophia. I don't think there's going to be, and I really hope I'm not wrong about this, any kind of direct confrontation. I think that would come at human, economic, and political cost that is way too high for the Trump administration right now. It is really more, at least for now, as kind of a diversion tactic and blowing up stuff and also pushing the boundaries, seeing how far they can go with this new Department of War, seeing how many war crimes they can commit without any sort of accountability. There is a distinct possibility in the air, and the Trump administration itself has admitted, of striking targets inside Venezuela and possibly trying to kill Venezuelan leaders. We have seen the Israel modus operandi of just taking out leaders in other countries with complete impunity. So that's that's always on the cards, and certainly the US has the military means at its disposal right there on Venezuela's doorstep. But in terms of actually occupying Venezuela and putting in power a puppet government, I think that's completely out of the cards right now. There's just too much potential for resistance and becoming a quagmire that would be 10 times worse than Iraq. And to pick up on the last thing that Gerald said, Venezuela does have a lot of friends, and that's it's also very heartening to see internationalism come to the fore in these situations. There has been military cooperation with Iran, with Russia, also some Chinese equipment. Not to say that, Venezuela would not stand a chance in any kind of armed conflict, and no neighbors would come to Venezuela's side in terms of engaging in any kind of military conflict. But it does have tools, and it does have a very committed army with these very firm Bolivarian anti-imperialist principles, and also, as I was mentioning in the beginning with the militia, very defiant people in terms of not being threatened by imperialism. So, and of course, then there will be a very significant diplomatic fallout, which depends on how much the Trump administration really cares about that. But I think for now, a hotter war is not necessarily on the cards.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. So we're nearing the end, and we have another group question. So this one says, many of our friends on the left curiously claim that Maduro and the current Venezuelan leadership are not worthy of our support and solidarity. But is your response? What is your response to that claim, and how should our internationalist audience stand in solidarity with the Bolivarian Revolution and the Venezuelan people?
let me take this one first, because for us at Venezuela Analysis, we are an independent outlet, an English-speaking outlet, so we have a lot of contact with the solidarity movements. And basically, my first answer would be that this is the wrong question to pose. It's not a matter of solidarity with Maduro or with the government. I think sometimes the international left, and I think this is more of a phenomenon in the global north, feel like this is like a sports competition, so you have to choose the one that's most aligned with your own principles, and it's not really about that. International solidarity is not about that. You don't have to uncritically support everything that the Maduro government does in order to have a solid principled anti-imperialist stance, which is what's at stake here. And if we talk, for example, about the Caribbean, and we look at what's the horizon, not even talking about socialism or anything of that sort, just kind of sovereign path towards development. What's the obstacle to that? It's U.S. imperialism. So the question of what you think of Maduro comes after that. It's a second order question. Of course, as internationalists and as activists, we should be interested in what happens in Venezuela as well as what happens in Guyana and Trinidad, to understand how countries deal with imperialist pressures, how they deal with their own development projects. In the case of Venezuela, what happens to a socialist project when it's under sanctions, what kind of concessions do you have to make, what kind of concessions are necessary, and what concessions are not necessary. All of that, I think, enriches our own political capabilities and our understanding. But it has nothing to do with internationalism and international solidarity. I think here there's no gray areas in terms of opposing U.S. imperialism, especially when it manifests itself in such a blatant military way in the Caribbean, committing these horrific crimes against a boat carrying 11 people. Actually, there was a report in, I believe it was the Intercept, that said that the boat actually saw aircraft and tried to turn away, but that didn't stop the US military from going after it, and actually it bombed it first. There were survivors, and then it went and struck it again just to ensure that it killed everyone. So here, regardless of what you think of Maduro, he has policies that you can support, maybe policies that you should think about and reflect and debate. Here, I think that there's a very clear-cut question of what it means to oppose imperialism, especially in such a naked form as we're seeing right now.
Yeah, I agree. Sorry,
Yeah.
if I could just go first.
Go ahead.
I agree completely, Ricardo, because we have to remember that regime change coming out of the State Department did not begin with President Maduro becoming the president of the Bolivarian Republic. It was so with Chavez, President Chavez. There was a coup d'etat against President Chavez, and the US recognized the person who the coup makers presented as the president of Venezuela. You remember they made up open official statement. And then there was a major strike in the oil industry trying to cripple when President Chavez was very much the popular leader, elected and so on. And that strike was being supported by the United States. In fact, Trinidad and Tobago's government at the time provided products, oil products, gasoline and other products to Venezuela in support of the government of Venezuela, which was the duly elected government of Venezuela of President Chavez. So the regime change has been underway, and regime change has been part of US imperialism in this region for, for over 200 years. Regime change in Haiti many times, Dominican Republic in 1965, Salvador Allende, whose I think assassination we commemorate either yesterday or today. Allende was brought down by a coup d'etat organized and supported by the US. And we could, Arbenz in Guatemala in 1953, we could go right through the region and of course outside of the region and identify how the US operates. And therefore, interventions in Cuba at the turn of the last century and so on. So we cannot say that it is about the individual person. If there is an attempt to bring about regime change, which is a violation of the sovereignty of another country, and the principle of non-interference in internal affairs of another country. And we can't also turn our backs on the unified position of the Caribbean and Latin America that this must be a zone of peace. We can't turn our backs on those principles because you may not like something that somebody did as a government, because no government and no leader is perfect and implements everything perfectly according to whatever ideological position A, B, or C may have. So that's not the thing. And therefore, if we take a position that we don't want to engage in solidarity and defend the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela and its sovereignty against US imperialism, then where do you draw the line? Gerald is quite correct, because I fear for Cuba. I really think this is targeted significantly at Cuba, even more than Venezuela. So where do you draw the line? And there was a famous saying by a German theologian, Gerald, you might remember his name, was it Bonhoeffer or one of the other famous German theologians, who said, when they came for the communists, I said nothing because I was not a communist. When they came for the trade unionists, I said nothing because I was a trade unionist. When they came for the Jews, I said nothing because I wasn't a Jew. When they came for me, there was nobody left to say anything for me. And therefore, we must stand on principle and defend those principles regardless. And quietly, as comrades, you could engage in debate about policy A, B, or C of our leadership, as the case may be.
Well, Sister Sophia, you've heard the authentic left there, a representative of the authentic left. Clear as crystal, my brother David Abdulah. You know, the Chinese revolutionary leader Mao Zedong wrote an excellent piece on contradiction and on the correct handling of contradiction and what he refers to as principle of contradictions and secondary contradiction. As David pointed out, no revolutionary process and no leader is perfect. The fundamental contradiction is between us defending our sovereignty, fighting for true independence, between us completing the national liberation struggle and resisting US imperialism. That is the fundamental. This is the issue. This is the issue. The white, the European, when you said the left are reluctant to extend solidarity. That's the white left, to be more precise, the West European left and sections of the left, white left in the United States. If you look at the left wing and progressive and revolutionary forces, like in the United States, the Black Alliance of Peace, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, that had 2 female candidates in the last election, and the All African People's Revolutionary Party. If you look at the EFF in South Africa, and there are many organizations across the African continent, from Burkina Faso right across Mali, all those, they're saying that the Bolivarian Revolution, up to yesterday I saw that from the All African People's Revolutionary Party, that the Bolivarian Revolution is part of the African World Revolution. And as if you are really an anti-imperialist and you claim that you're in the left, then you have to support the Bolivarian Revolution. This is not about President Maduro. This is about supporting a revolution that is under threat by the US Leviathan, the big bully. And the white left, the Western left, Kwame Ture, the great revolutionary Pan-Africanist, told us years ago, he said that very often the white left is as imperialistic as the white right. And we've seen it. So if there's sections of the left that is saying that, we cannot support, if they see it in terms of extending solidarity, because if you do, it would be supporting President Maduro. That's the fake left. That is the left that are cheerleaders, the imperialists. And we saw how they cheerlead when it came to Iraq. We saw them how they cheerlead in Afghanistan, how they cheerlead in Libya, and so on. And there's a particular tendency in that left, the Trotskyites, and not all sections, but the neo-Trotskyites and some of the so-called democratic socialists who are nothing more but in the social democratic tradition. So we call that the imperialist left. So I just wanted to clarify that, because Brother David, we and like so many of us in the region, and those who constitute the Assembly of the Caribbean people, we constitute an authentic left. We know exactly where we stand, and we know that the contradiction, the fundamental contradiction, is between us fighting, resisting imperialism to protect our sovereignty, to attain true independence, and to make the Caribbean a zone of peace.
Wow, wow. I'm so moved by this time with you all today. This has been extremely powerful, and yeah, there's so much that we can go back in and listen to, and that's all the questions I had for today. Is there anything in particular you all want to address or say before we come off tonight?
But just to say thank you very much, first of all, and great being on this panel with Gerald and Ricardo. Gerald mentioned the Assembly of Caribbean People. We just issued a declaration which has a sign-on component. I did share the email with you, Sophia, and with the network. I'm just asking everyone to share it around and let people sign in support of our position that the Caribbean must be a zone of peace, and that we must say no to any U.S. or other kinds of military intervention and other calls. So that defense of Cuba, that the U.S. administration must end this blockade against Cuba. It's illegal, it's illegitimate, it's criminal, and also remove them from the so-called list of countries that are sponsoring terrorism, because that's just a fake list, and so on. And also in support of Haiti, that there must be no mercenaries in Haiti, and a number of other calls like that. So we ask people to sign on to the declaration and share it around as widely as possible.
I'd like to say thanks for having me in the program. Look forward to more of this. And I would like to say that the Organization for the Victory of the People, we fully support the Bolivarian Revolution. We stand against imperialism. We are very consistent on principle, and our position on that is non-negotiable. We support the People's Republic of China. We support the Russian people in the war against Ukrainian fascism. We support the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. We stand firmly with Cuba, and that the criminal sanctions should be lifted, that the Caribbean should remain and should be a zone of peace.
Yeah, just to echo what my co-panelist said, it's been a great experience. I learned a lot, and it's also very heartening to see such genuine and principled internationalism in these times of heightened imperialist threats. And also thanks, Sophia, for leading the discussion. I look forward to future ones.
Yes, thank you all. We'll sign the document. And again, it has been my great pleasure and honor learning from each and every one of you. And, we look forward to you all coming back on the show in the future. So have a great night. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in.
Yeah. Thank you. All the best. Yeah.
Thank you. Same here.